Welcome, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. This is going to be a lecture on the Federalist debates, sometimes called the constitutional debates. And just to give you a brief outline of what we're going to be covering, we're really just going to start in the 1770s, the founding of the United States, the general attitude of the time. Then we're going to cover the discourse between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist a little bit, who they were, what they supported. And then we're going to move on to who won, who was the winner, and then we'll wrap things up. So, it's fairly straightforward. People make these things way harder than they need to be. You're going to get all the information that you need to know, and if you want to go be an expert in it, by all means, feel free to go read some more if you would like. But there's not necessarily a point for most people to do that, unless you're really interested in the topic, or, maybe you need to learn something for a test or something, but I highly doubt it. So we're going to start off with this lecture. It's going to give you a nice introduction to the Federalist debates, and we'll go from there. So starting off, we're going to take things back all the way to 1776. Okay, the United States of America just declared its independence from Great Britain, and we are now a sovereign nation in the eyes of Americans and some other people who were backing us, and not Britain. So the rebellious colonies turned to making themselves a sovereign nation? What? That's pretty interesting. These things didn't happen that much before 1776. So it was a pretty rare event that you had a revolution, right? I mean, you had the English Revolution with Cromwell before the 1600s, but now we're in 1776. This is something that's it's still extremely new and just didn't really happen, So we rebel from Great Britain. We fight a war over it, which would last until 1783. However, in 1777, we actually adopted what was called the Articles of Confederation, which were documents that essentially solidified a new government for the new country, the United States of America. And it was essentially a document that was like the Constitution, not necessarily in content, but it was a document creating the government, and it loosely tied together the states, right, under one governing body, very loosely, very, very loosely. And so, for instance, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you're a Virginian, right? You are a Virginian. Okay, I'm a Virginian. Yeah, I'm a Virginian, right? No, you are a Virginian. You're not an American, right? You may say you're an American too. No, you wouldn't. Not back then. Back then, you were considered a Virginian. If somebody asked who you were, you wouldn't say, "Hey, I'm an American." No. You were a Virginian. People identified with their states in specific, and their states had a lot of power. They were almost like countries we can think of today. It'd be like, oh, I'm a Canadian. Oh, I'm a Mexican. Oh, I'm an American. Back then, it'd be like, oh, I'm a Virginian. Oh, I'm an Ohioan. Oh, I'm I just name any state, and you can sort of get the picture. I'm a South Carolinian, for instance, you could say. So things like that, right? They really identified with their states very heavily. And this document basically had the states loosely tied. It was more ceremonial, the whole governing body of things, the United States of America. The federal government. It was very, very, very ceremonial. That's why you guys may have heard in the past, somebody may have said something to you, maybe a teacher in the past, that the United States of America actually had presidents before George Washington. Well, it's somewhat true, right? In name, they were considered a president, but it wasn't anything like we think of a president today. I mean, they essentially had no power. It was pretty much strictly ceremonial, right? And so they weren't really the presidents. They're sort of like a little figurehead. Hey, I'm the president. Blah blah blah. Ceremonial in almost its entirety. It was ceremonial, and so the Articles of Confederation had a number of problems. Okay, a whole number of problems. And we wouldn't end up getting rid of it until 1787. The Articles, I would say, had mainly two problems with it. Two main reasons why it was just a horrible document. It did not work. It was an utter failure. One of the reasons was it did not give the federal government the right to levy taxes upon its citizens, right? So you may have been a citizen of the United States, but you didn't. But you paid taxes to the state. Right? You didn't pay taxes to the U.S. government like we do today. Okay, so if the U.S. government wanted taxes, They didn't have the ability to do that. They had to go ask and beg the states to give them money for things if they wanted something done. And if you're a governor or a politician in a state, why on earth would you give the federal government money? Like, if you're an Ohioan, you don't care about what's happening in Virginia. I mean, this is the 1780s. There's no social media, right? Newspapers were relatively local, and maybe there was statewide in some instances. And it was just a completely different world. I mean, you were really concerned about people in your town almost, and that was pretty much it. People did do some traveling back then and whatnot, but it was, I mean, God, it was almost nothing like what we think of it today. It was extremely different. And that's where the whole idea of ruling over the land with which you occupy came from almost, right? Like for instance, right, you want to be ruled by leaders who are closest to you, right? We just left a king in Great Britain. A tyrannical leader is what all the cool kids were saying back then. We had to leave King George, the tyrannical king, and so we left him, and we try to get people to rule over us who were closer to us. So we have the states, for instance, right? You're not going to have somebody in Virginia ruling over somebody in Ohio, right? Or just at least in that region is that far away, for instance. And then we have local governments as well. So you can see like a separation starting to be created here. And then we have what was called federalism, even though it was federalism to a very small degree, where you had the state governments and the federal government. So we left this, right, and we want to be ruled by people closer to you. It's called republicanism, not the republicanism that you're thinking of today, with people like Donald Trump, for instance, and the Republican Party or Democrat Party. Not like that. Republicanism is you rule over the place with which you occupy. People closest to you rule. And so that was a big thing that was floating around then. And so states had the right to tax, federal government did not. That's the first thing. And very important to understand, extremely important. If there was a social program that the government wanted for people, they had to go get the money from somewhere, and that was the states. Okay, and so you can imagine that's going to be extremely rough for people to get anything done at the federal level. It was impossible. Okay, it was impossible. And so lots of things that we needed done just weren't able to get done. Things that other countries would be able to do, we weren't able to do, because you might be able to do it in one state, but then all the other states refuse. And so that's a big problem if you're going to try to have yourself under one nation, or one, not necessarily nation, but one state. And the second thing was they didn't really have the ability to raise an army, right? You would go to state militias instead, and the state militias would provide you with troops that you could use to fight wars. Now, thankfully, we didn't get into any wars after 1783 to, well, really till the 1800s, again, early 1800s. But 1801 would be our next war. So we didn't get into a war from 1783 to 1801, which was a phenomenal thing, okay? So we got pretty lucky in that regards, because had somebody tried to start a war, it would have been pretty hard to raise an army. For all of us, we would have to ask the states to do that. And again, they're selfish. They're looking out for their own interest. They don't necessarily care what everybody else has to do. And another thing, too, was there was really no federal money back then as well. So I'll throw that in there as a bonus point almost, even though it's not necessarily as important. We had what was called constitutional currency. And so the federal government would have money, right? But it wasn't anything like what we think of it today. The buying power was extremely limited, and each state had their own currency, right? So you had Ohio money, for instance, Virginian money, for instance, and that's how you paid with things. And people didn't accept it in other states, for instance. Maybe they do, but the conversion rates would be all out of whack. And, people didn't really understand the whole concept of inflation as much back then either. So, there's a whole bunch of money floating around, and it was just horrible for the economy, right? Made trade a whole fiasco. Though bartering was a bit more common back then too, so maybe you could say it's a little bit better in that regards. But made things a whole annoying mess in terms of currency. And so we need to fix that as well. Okay, so again, we'll repeat that. The federal government did not have the right to levy taxes upon its citizens, right? They didn't have the ability to raise an army. They had to go ask the states. And states also print their own currency. So you can sort of see a pattern here. The states had basically all the power as opposed to the federal government. And again, it's because we didn't want an authoritarian leader. We just came from the tyrannical king, which just rolled over Great Britain and rolled over the colonies with an iron fist, and we escaped it, right? We don't want some other government ruling over us, being tyrannical. So we're going to try to stray far away from that. We're going to have our own state governments ruled by people in our own state, you can think of it as colony, ruling over us. And that way we're going to feel a lot more secure. Our interest will be more looked after by having people from our own state rule over us. And so that was sort of what was happening here back in 1777 up to 1787. Right, so we have about 10 years the Articles of Confederation are active. Okay, and so moving on. Eventually, we would scrap these articles. Right, we realized that they were no longer going to work for the reasons that we just mentioned. Okay, and a bunch of the founding fathers met in secret, actually, and they decided that we're going to draft up a new document to be ratified. And we're going to draft up a new document, and we're going to send it out to be ratified by all of the states. Okay, and then when we get that, then that document will be the new document to solidify a new government for the United States of America. That's going to hopefully try to make the federal government a little bit stronger, like it is today, a lot stronger like it is today. And so a huge debate broke out over this as soon as it was sent out. And another thing which is pretty interesting though, and this is just a side note, right? You can almost think of it as almost like a coup, for instance, a coup over the American government. Though you can imagine that there was consenting parties and whatnot, and a lot of these people were officials and leaders in politics. It's like they just established a new government casually. You know what I mean? And the states eventually would have to ratify it, yes, to make it all legit, but they're really just trying to like make things better. So you can imagine how hard it was to figure these things out back then, especially in a time before all the knowledge that we have today. I mean, it was really hard to do these things. And they all got together. There was no women. It's just rich white men working on these documents, and they would send it all out to be ratified and whatnot by the states. And then we'll again transition into the whole debate, right? So a huge debate breaks out between two political factions that we call the Federalist and the Antifederalist, okay? And we'll go into who they were. So those in favor of the new Constitution were called the Federalist, okay? The Constitution as is, that was drafted up in secret and then sent out to all the states to be ratified, okay? Those people were called the Federalist. And then there was other people who were against it, and they were called the Anti-Federalist, okay? So two factions going on here, okay? Moving on. So who were members of the Federalist, okay? So the Federalists were people like Hamilton, Madison, Jay, for instance, right? And they were writing under the name Plebeius. And they were supported by a lot of, property owners, wealthy merchants, northern states, and urban areas. Okay? And then we had the Anti-Federalists, which were people like Jefferson, Mason, Henry, and Hancock. And they were supported by people like small farmers, shopkeepers, workers, and rural in southern areas. Okay? People in rural and southern areas. Okay, but who are these people, right? Who were the Federalists and what did they support? Okay? Well, there's a couple of things, really. It's really just two main things, right? The Federalists wanted a very strong central government, the kind that we have today, but they did not want a Bill of Rights. They did not want a Bill of Rights. Then you had the Anti-Federalist, who wanted the state governments to sort of reign supreme, like it was underneath the Articles of Confederation, but they also wanted a Bill of Rights, so the government couldn't trample on their rights and infringe upon them. And so this debate's breaking out, right? Again, the Federalists were the types of people who were the very elitist types of characters, right? Wealthy merchants, right? Wealthy landowners, people in urban areas more so, property owners. These were the people who wanted power, and they wanted to keep it for themselves. I struggle to say that they were concerned about oppressing people. even though they did that. I feel like it was more so they wanted to keep their power and not have it be taken away from them. They didn't want it stripped, and so they were going to do anything they could to protect that power. And so by making a very strong central government, which doesn't necessarily guarantee the rights of the people, the Federalist would have almost an out. Necessarily, the people overstayed their welcome, or overstepped the line, crossed the line in terms of what we're going to give them to keep them silent and in line. Then we're going to have the ability to do so. There won't be any roadblocks in our way, right? Because we know what's best, right? And so these are the type of people like Madison, for instance, right? And there's a famous quote from Madison. Madison says that the purpose of this government that we are creating is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That is the purpose of government. Protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And essentially what that means is the purpose is to protect all the wealthy elite landowners or merchants from all the peasants. And they felt that was fine. They felt that, why should we, give these people, they don't even know how to read, they don't have the time to study politics, why should we let them make any laws? It will be nice, right? We won't infringe upon their rights. We'll just take care of our own, right? We'll protect what we have because we know best. That's why we're here in the first place, right? We know best, obviously. Look at these people. They don't know anything. That's essentially where they're coming from. Because think about it. If we give them power, we give those people power via democracy. Well, then they're just going to go and they're going to enact what we call agrarian reform. And agrarian reform is essentially just taking land and redistributing it from the wealthy landowners, which is where you derived most of your money from back in the 1700s, through land ownership. And so they were extremely scared of this. And so they enacted a whole bunch of things in the new government. For instance, we had things like the Electoral College, for instance. It's an extremely elitist institution. It has roots, dating, it really has roots in the sense that roots in this elitist type of thinking, in the sense that people, if they made the wrong choice, the Electoral College could override them. So if the choice wasn't in the interest of the wealthy elites, then it doesn't matter what the people voted for. Who cares what the people want? We got to look out for ourselves, right? It's like a fail-safe almost. That's what the Electoral College was useful for. And so that's sort of where the Federalists are coming from. They're very elitist type characters. Out for their own, and that is it. They're not out for people like you or I. Okay, and then we have the Anti-Federalists, and again, these are people supported more by people like small farmers, for instance. Maybe shopkeepers, workers, rural workers, people in more southern areas and whatnot, as opposed to urban. And these are the type of people who they were more out to giving people more of a say in government, okay? And when I say people more of a say in government, most of the time I'm meaning just white men, okay? And as opposed to just wealthy elite white men, that is more so what we mean, right? For instance, right, there are cases of women voting, before the 1920s. However, it was only in like one state, and so, or like in states, like as they were, states individually would maybe let women vote in some instances, but it wasn't a common thing. Okay, it wasn't common, so we're just sort of going to toss that aside, and even then, it would only be if you were like a white woman, for instance, or maybe like a wealthy white woman, one with a lot of clout and power, and then if you were a minority, I mean, Jesus Christ, if you weren't a slave, then it was just, even then you were pretty much a second-class citizen, unless you were like extremely lucky. And we're not going to look at the extremes. We're going to look at 99.99% of people. And then, so we covered women, minorities. They were treated like death. And then even the white men, which is what people often forget too. Even white men were treated absolutely terribly. You know what I mean? Unless you were an elite person up until like really when the Constitution was being adopted, like you had it rough, dude. It was very rough for you. I mean, life was miserable. Like, yes, you had it better than the other groups too, but I mean, you were still being oppressed by everybody. Life was just full of misery. And so these people were now trying to get some power because of the Anti-Federalist. You know what I mean? They were like really trying to give these people more power. And the Federalists also wanted to get more people involved as well, but they were really trying to secure it from the Anti-Federalist side of things. And they were really out for their rights with the Bill of Rights. So again, the Federalists, just to bring things back a little bit, they felt that elite were best. They don't trust people to govern themselves, okay? And, because the government is so removed from regular people. I mean, it's not like you just hop on Twitter in 1787 and just start, researching politics via like the news that's popping up, or going on Google and typing it, or Google Scholar and typing in for academic articles. It's not a thing. You can't just go to libraries and get books. You can't just watch the news on TV or YouTube or wherever, or watch documentaries or lectures. I mean, it's not a thing. Okay, and so people, if they weren't extremely educated back then, were like going to college, for instance, which was extremely rare, and you had to be very wealthy to afford it. And people aren't going to know about these things, and in some instances, they would, and they'd read from their newspapers a lot, which was very helpful. But the Federalists said no. If they're not like reading all about this, they don't know absolutely everything. I just dropped my ring. If they don't know absolutely everything, then there's no reason to have them ruling for us. I mean, it's just stupid. They're going to run our country into the ground. They're going to infringe upon our rights and our rights to oppress them, essentially. And so that's where the Federalists are coming from. And then the Anti-Federalists, again, they saw the elites as corrupt. They said, look, dude, we know what you guys are out for. We know that you care about power, and you want to protect it all for yourself and leave everybody else behind. And so we're going to try to help out the people. We feel more people should be involved in the political process and get out of our business. Because you're going to oppress everybody. That's what they felt. And so Federalist versus Anti-Federalist. Okay? And so now let's cover somewhat of the plans. Okay? So the Federalists like the new Constitution with a powerful central government. Okay? They really like the new Constitution, powerful central government. Anti-Federalists preferred the Articles of Confederation because the states had more power. Again, these are people out for the state governments to reign supreme, as opposed to the new almighty supreme federal government that the Federalists were drafting up. Okay, and so there's a divide right there, and where the power should lie, in the federal government or the states. Okay, pretty interesting one. And then we'll go on to the Federalist. We're talking about the Constitution creating a government with limited powers that is no threat to individual rights. They felt that each state will have their own constitution as well, and that will also protect rights of people. Okay, so they felt that since the Constitution specifically lists out the rights of the government, okay, that those are only going to be the rights that they're really going to focus on with the federal government. It's not going to just extend its hand into everything, like some octopus just reaching out everywhere, getting its nose in everybody's business. And the states are still going to have a whole lot of power, because anything that's not directly given, any powers that's not directly given to the central government, it's going to go to the states. The states get all the rest of the power, right? So they're saying, like, look, I mean, it's still a limited government, right? You don't got to worry about us getting tyrannical. And so they felt there was no threat to individual rights, and therefore we don't need a Bill of Rights, because it's no threat to people's is rights. Okay, it has its rights listed out, and that's it. Simple as that. Right? It's not going to infringe upon people's rights. That's crazy to think so. So we don't need that guaranteed protection, and if they want guaranteed protection, then they can go to the states for it. And that's what the states are for. States still have power, so that's what they felt. And then the Anti-Federalists said the government is way too powerful. Okay, government's too powerful, and the Bill of Rights is necessary because the Constitution does not do enough, right? So the Anti-Federalists are saying, it's like, well, yeah, you list out the powers and you're giving the rest to the states, but you can enact laws which help as long as they're constitutional. And therefore, you're going to have an ungodly amount of power that's going to trump state power. It's like, yeah, we'll just be left aside. We'll just get the scraps, okay? And then eventually we'll just sort of be worked out all together, and we we won't even necessarily have any power in the future if that continues. And so they're very, very against the whole idea of a central government. They felt that it was way too powerful, and that if we are going to do something like that and have a very strong central government, well, then we at the very least, need a Bill of Rights to guarantee protection for our individual liberties, right? Like we want to be ensured, even though you say that this won't happen, right? We want to be ensured that the government will protect our freedom of speech, for instance, right? Or our right to assembly, okay? Or our right to a trial by jury, okay? And this is extremely important to us. This is what we want, and we know that you say that you won't do it, but we don't trust you. We know that it's going to end up getting tyrannical at one point or another, and even if it doesn't, just the idea that it could be, or the option that it could be, we want to stray away from that. And so we need the Bill of Rights to protect us. And that's what the Anti-Federalists thought. So moving on here. The Federalists said that the states need the central government, okay? And that the Constitution shares power with the states, which is federalism, okay? And so they're essentially saying that, look, the state governments, guys, like, they need us, okay? I mean, we can't have anything like at a federal level, and we can't even hold our own as a country, or fight wars, or productively fight wars, or get any programs going unless you guys help us out here. Like we still need the states for many things, but we still need the federal government. We're gonna share power with you guys, and you guys need us too for protection, right? What if a war happens and it's only attacking, say, Virginia, right? We need all the other states to back you up. You know what I mean? Because it's still an attack on America, okay? And so you guys need us, we need you. We're sharing power. It's federalism, sharing power between state and federal governments. And then Anti-Federalists said the new Constitution will take away the states' power. Again, they're worried about the federal government enacting laws that are constitutional, but far and wide. And so therefore, they're just going to infringe over time on the states' rights and sort of, wipe away any power that the states had, okay? And so Anti-Federalists were extremely concerned with that. They wanted the states to reign supreme as opposed to federal government. And then the Federalists wanted the federal government to reign supreme over the states' government. Okay. Federalists wanted the Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists didn't want a Bill of Rights. Federalists did not want a Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists did want the Bill of Rights. My bad. And so we'll move on. The Federalists also felt that a strong president is necessary to enforce the laws and conduct foreign policy, but there should be limits to their power. Okay, in other words, we need somebody that can hold their own to all these monarchs around Europe, for instance, or elsewhere, and negotiate on behalf of the country almost. And we need somebody who's like the figurehead, you know what I mean? And they felt that was fine to have a president, whereas the Anti-Federalists said that's basically a king. They have too much power, and we're terrified of it. Again, you have to remember that we just came from a bloody war where thousands of people died fighting to leave a king, to leave a government that had a king. And so we don't want anything even close to that, as what an Anti-Federalist would say, and that's why they want state governments as opposed to a strong central government. And the Federalists, they felt that we need it, and it's fine because there's checks and balances, and we're going to separate powers in the federal government. We're going to have an executive branch, and a judicial branch, a legislative branch. Not one person's going to have all the power of government, and even if they start doing some very powerful things, there's checks to that and balances. And so if somebody gets out of line, well, another branch can just go check them, and then we'll get right back to a nice balance of power. Okay, so that's sort of a pretty interesting one, I find. They're talking about people who are extremely powerful in their own right, but then they can also be checked. Something that was not really happening before all this, right? So it's a very new concept. Because before, you just give all the power to, an autocrat. They sort of do as they please, and maybe there's a governing body of some sorts that in rare instances meets. or maybe in some countries, if you're lucky, there was like something like a legislative branch or a Congress. But it was very rare, guys. It was very, very rare. And so Anti-Federalists were terrified. I mean, they were absolutely terrified. You know, they probably had relatives and stuff who just died in this war, or they knew somebody. And they didn't want to go back to it. They did not want to go back to it. And so they were extremely opposed to it. Federalists wanted it. They felt that it was necessary. And the government was constructed as such. And then lastly, the Federalists felt that the Supreme Court is the weakest branch of government because it can't pass laws or control the military. And it's appropriate in the system of checks and balances. Whereas the Anti-Federalists said that since justices don't have to answer to anybody, the Supreme Court is too powerful. So who does the Supreme Court answer to? They just determine if laws are constitutional or not. They don't answer to anybody. Okay? They really did not like that. They felt that it was way too powerful, and it was something they were extremely against. Whereas the Federalists said, look, guys, they're weak. They can't even control the military or make laws. They just determine if it's constitutional or not. Okay? So it's appropriate in the system of checks and balances. There's nothing to fear. And so those were really some of the key differences there. But mainly what you guys have to recognize is just these two things, okay? Number one, the Federalist did not want a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalist did want a Bill of Rights, so that way the government couldn't infringe upon people's liberties. They're natural born liberties. They want to protect those, as opposed to potentially having them infringed upon by some tyrannical government or some government that goes rogue, if there's nothing to check its power or keep it in line. So there's that difference with the Bill of Rights. And then the second difference is Federalists wanted a very, very strong central government like we have today. And the Anti-Federalists did not. I mean, they were terrified of it. They did not want it. They wanted the state governments to rule pretty much as, again, separate countries almost, underneath one loose treaty, which is binding us all together as Americans. And so that's really the difference, guys. But in the end, this is what happens. So the debate goes on, and the Constitution would eventually be ratified. But the Bill of Rights would have to be included. And so we got the strong central government, and the Bill of Rights was added onto that, the first 10 amendments. And so that is where we are at, the first 10 amendments. And so the first 10 amendments they're pretty straightforward. I could read them out. But I mean, they're nothing like really too crazy, you know. I mean, it's just, you know, everybody knows them, like freedom of speech, for instance, you know, right to a trial by jury, you know, things like that. But you know, we can read this out really quickly here. So you have like the First Amendment, for instance, freedom of religion, speech, the press and assembly, the right to petition, the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. Then there was the Third Amendment, which is protection from being forced to quarter troops, which you can imagine was a big problem back in the day. And you don't want troops sitting in, you know, with your wife and kids as you're out working, right? As you can imagine what was happening when that was all going on. They're just left alone in people's houses. I don't think I have to say it for you, but you get the gist. It's a pretty bad thing. And then they're also eating your food and whatnot and taking whatever they want almost with total immunity. So you really don't want that, like, at all, okay? Like, how weird would it be if a troop was just come into your house and then just start, like, doing whatever they wanted? Like, that would just be, like, no, that's crazy. You don't want that at all. And so they enacted the Third Amendment for that reason. The Fourth Amendment is protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Fifth was the right to due process, protection from self-incrimination and double jeopardy, and eminent domain. For instance, double jeopardy would be like you can't be tried twice for a crime, right? So if you get off on murder, you can't be tried for murder again, right? That's double jeopardy. And then eminent domain, for instance, is like the government can buy property for fair market value as opposed to just taking it from you, which would have been a problem in the past in other countries. And then sixth, the rights to a speedy trial and trial by jury, the rights to confront one's accusers and the right to a defense counsel. Seventh, the right to a jury for civil disputes. The Eighth Amendment is protection from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail. And then the ninth is protection of rights which are not specifically mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. And the 10th is powers are not given to the federal government by the Constitution will rest with the states and the people. So those are the first 10 amendments. and those were included in the Bill of Rights. And that's essentially wrapping things up here. So we go all the way from the start. Again, whole worried about tyranny, and this whole debate breaks out between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, two political factions. In the end, we got the strong central government, but it's checked and we'll say somewhat kept in line by the Bill of Rights, which were their first 10 amendments. And nowadays, there's tens more amendments, which have been added to the Constitution, which we can cover later. But these were the first 10, and it's pretty interesting stuff. It's important to understand what the purpose of the founding of the government was, what the purpose of what the foundation of the government was, and the reasoning for its construction, but the reasoning behind its construction from the founders themselves. Like, for instance, we mentioned with Madison, again, the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's the purpose of government. That is exactly what he said. And so we have to watch out for these things, guys, and we have to recognize these things so we can protect the rights of people moving forward in our country and recognize where we came from. It was a different time period, for sure. I mean, things were totally different. They knew nothing. The average person knows a billion times more than what these people knew back then. But these were some of the brightest people in the world back then, and they were trying their hand at things, right? At creating a whole new government, something that almost never been done before. You can imagine the pressure on these things. I mean, just even think, like, for the Revolutionary War, had they lost that, they were all dead. Anybody who signed the Declaration of Independence, they're dead. Okay, so these people are sticking their necks out, and then when they were successful, unfortunately, they weren't successful the first time. They had to redo it again, draft up a new government, and it was better the second time around, to say the least. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for some more content. And yeah, we'll talk to you guys soon. Everybody have a nice day.